I had worked the night shift at diner for over a year, and I'd gotten used to the usual routine. Empty roads, the quiet hum of the fridge, and the low murmur of old tunes on the jukebox. It wasn't the kind of place that drew much attention, and honestly, I preferred it that way. But there was one night that changed everything. It was just past 2 a.m. when the door jingled, signaling someone had entered. I glanced up from the counter, expecting a regular, maybe a trucker or some night owl looking for a cup of coffee. But what I saw made my stomach churn. A man, tall and thin, wearing a leather jacket that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. He walked slowly, almost deliberately, toward the counter. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there for a long, awkward moment, staring at the menu above my head. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes moved from the menu to me, and something about his stare felt off. Cold. Hollow. As if he was looking through me, not at me. I tried to smile, but it felt forced. My mind was already on edge. You get used to the usual late-night customers, drunk, tired, hungry. But this guy was different. Finally, he muttered, "Just coffee. Black." I nodded, quickly turning to make his order. As I poured the coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, still staring. His fingers tapped on the counter, just once, slowly. It felt like a signal. A warning. I handed him the coffee. His fingers brushed mine, and I almost jumped back. His touch was ice cold, like he'd been holding snow for hours. "Thank you," he said in a low voice, but it was too late. I could hear something else in his tone. Something that didn't belong in a diner at this hour. I was about to ask if he needed anything else when the door opened again. This time, it was different, faster, more urgent. Two other men walked in, both of them in similar worn jackets, their faces hidden beneath hoods. One of them, short and stocky, immediately made a beeline for the booth in the corner. The other stood by the door, as if keeping watch. I wasn't stupid. I knew something was off. The tall man at the counter didn't seem to acknowledge the newcomers. He just sat there, his fingers still tapping slowly, rhythmically on the counter. But there was something in the air now. A tension I couldn't shake. The hairs on my neck stood up. The stocky man at the booth turned his head slightly, catching my gaze. I quickly looked away. But in that brief second, I saw his eyes, wide, unblinking. Too wide. I had to stop myself from shuddering. I turned to the coffee machine, pretending to busy myself, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw the tall man get up. Slowly. Too slowly. He walked toward the back of the diner, toward the bathroom, but then he stopped. For a brief second, I thought I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. A flash of light. A glint of something metallic in his hand. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. It was a knife. Before I could react, the door slammed open again, and more people flooded in, too many, too fast. They surrounded the diner like a pack of wolves. That's when the panic set in. My breath quickened. I had to think fast, but I couldn't process what was happening. The tall man stepped forward, and I saw it, the knife gleaming in his hand, sharp, ready. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the look in his eyes as he turned back to me. "I don't think you'll be needing that coffee anymore," he whispered. I froze. The door behind me clicked shut. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It was a sound I was sure everyone in the diner could hear, but nobody was moving. The other two men, those who had entered with the tall one, stood still, their eyes never leaving me. The stocky man in the corner booth didn't even blink, just staring with that unsettling wide-eyed expression. I didn't know what to do. The knife in the tall man's hand seemed to glimmer in the low diner light, mocking me. My mind raced as I tried to think of an escape. The back door? No, too risky. I'd never make it past them. The tall man moved closer, taking slow, deliberate steps. I could smell the faint odor of stale cigarettes and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. "Look, man, I don't know who you are, but this isn't a place for whatever you're doing," I stammered, trying to sound calm. The words felt hollow even as I said them, and I could hear the quiver in my voice. He didn't respond right away. He just stared, tilting his head as if trying to study me. The other two didn't make a sound, just stood there like statues, waiting for something. And then, without warning, the man raised the knife. My pulse screamed in my ears as he took another step forward. I was going to die here. I didn't even know why they were doing this, but the fear, the dread, it was choking me. My fingers shook as I gripped the counter, trying to find some stability in this madness. "You think you're safe?" The tall man's voice broke through the silence. "You think this diner, this little hole in the wall, keeps you safe? You're wrong." I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't understand. This was just a late-night shift. A quiet shift. And now it felt like the walls were closing in on me. "Stop, just stop," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. The stocky man in the booth finally spoke up, his voice low and steady. "They always beg." The tall man glanced back at him, and the coldness in his eyes deepened. It was clear they had done this before. This wasn't some random crime. This was something they had planned, something that had happened before. The tall man lowered the knife slightly, but I wasn't relieved. If anything, I knew this wasn't over. One of the men at the door made a move, quick, sudden, almost too fast for me to react. He pulled something out of his jacket, and before I could make sense of it, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the diner. A crowbar. He grinned. Suddenly, the door behind me banged open again, the noise echoing through the diner. I froze. The tall man's gaze shifted, and for a split second, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. And then, I saw him. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the streetlights outside. He was tall, dressed in black, and his face was obscured by a cap. He didn't look like the others. He wasn't part of their group. But what caught my attention wasn't his appearance, it was the gun he held in his hand. For a second, time seemed to stand still. Everyone in the diner froze, staring at this new arrival. The man with the crowbar stopped mid-step, his eyes flicking to the gun and then back at the tall man. The newcomer didn't say a word. He just raised the gun and aimed it at the tall man, who didn't flinch. "Get out," the man with the gun said, his voice cold and calm. The tall man's lips curled into a smile. "You think you can stop us?" His voice was eerily quiet, as if he was speaking to a ghost. I couldn't understand what was happening. Who was this guy? Why was he here? My brain was still foggy from fear and confusion. The stocky man in the booth stood up, his eyes narrowed. "We don't leave." But the man with the gun didn't waver. "Leave. Now." It was the silence that followed that felt the heaviest. It stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, the tall man's gaze flicked back to me. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. He didn't move for a long time, and for a moment, I thought he might attack. But instead, he slowly lowered the knife. The tall man nodded once, a short, sharp movement, and then turned toward the door. His two companions followed without a word, walking past the man with the gun. I didn't know what had just happened. Who had saved me? Why had they left so easily? But just as the door clicked shut behind them, the man with the gun lowered it, his eyes scanning the room quickly. He took a breath, then turned toward me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. I didn't know how to answer. My chest was still tight with fear, my legs unsteady beneath me. I think so," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the night. I couldn't even remember what he looked like, just that dark figure and the gun. The diner was silent again. But it was a silence that felt different now, heavy with unanswered questions. I didn't know who they were or why they had come, but I did know one thing: I had narrowly escaped something far darker than I could have ever imagined. But the worst part? As I looked out the window, I saw them. The group, standing across the street, watching. Waiting. And I realized, the danger hadn't passed. The rest of that night passed in a blur of tension. I tried to pretend that everything was fine, but the truth kept clawing at the back of my mind. They were still out there. The group. Watching. Waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just come for me. No, it felt like something far more sinister was at play. But what? Why? I had to force myself to finish my shift. The minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. My hands shook every time I wiped down the counter, and every time I glanced out the window, I saw their shadowy figures standing just outside, moving in slow circles, like vultures waiting for something to die. The clock ticked past 5 a.m. And I was finally alone in the diner. Everyone had left. The usual crowd of truckers, late-night workers, and drunks were gone, leaving only the lingering smell of greasy food and stale coffee. But I wasn't alone. The door jingled again, and I turned, heart dropping into my stomach. It wasn't a customer this time. It was the tall man. He stood in the doorway, the same cold, hollow stare in his eyes. His leather jacket creaked as he stepped inside, the door shutting behind him with a final, echoing click. I froze, but this time, I didn't feel the panic I had before. Instead, there was something worse: anticipation. "Thought you'd get rid of us that easily?" His voice was low, almost playful, but the menace beneath it was undeniable. I backed away, my eyes darting around for anything I could use. The broom by the door. The coffee pot. Nothing. "You're not safe here," he said, stepping further into the diner. "Not anymore. We never leave, not until we get what we want." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. What did they want? What had I done to bring this upon myself? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't have anything. Just leave me alone." He smirked, the cold glint of the knife I'd seen earlier reappearing in his hand. "Oh, it's not about what you have, sweetheart. It's about what you've seen." My stomach twisted. The blood drained from my face. "Seen?" I echoed, my voice cracking. "What are you talking about?" He took another step closer, and I could see the wicked delight on his face. He was enjoying this. The power. The fear. My fear. "It doesn't matter. You'll know soon enough." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the diner. My heart stopped. It was as if someone had thrown something against the wall, but there was no one there. The tall man's eyes flickered to the noise, then back to me. His lips parted in a slow, chilling smile. "You hear that? It's coming," he murmured. "You've seen enough to understand. It's time for the next part." Before I could ask him what he meant, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind me. But they weren't coming from the front. They were coming from the kitchen. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The door to the kitchen was open, but the lights were off. I hadn't heard anyone enter. Another crash. Louder this time. And then, a voice. "Jenna." The voice was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice. Soft. Sweet. Yet, There was an edge to it that made my blood run cold. I turned back to the tall man, my heart racing. "Who is that?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just continued to smile, that terrifying, empty smile, the knife still glinting in his hand. And then, from the darkness of the kitchen, she stepped forward. A woman, tall, pale, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Her hair was jet black, cascading down her back in waves. She wore a long coat that reached her ankles, and her movements were slow, deliberate. But it wasn't just her appearance that made my breath catch. It was the feeling she brought with her, an oppressive, suffocating presence. Something ancient. "Jenna," she said again, her voice almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "It's time to pay." "Who are you?" I demanded again, my voice rising in desperation. The woman didn't answer right away. She just stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. And then, as she got closer, I noticed something on her hand. A ring. A thick, black band that glowed faintly in the dim light. The tall man chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "She's the reason you're still breathing." I blinked, confused. "What?" The woman finally spoke, her tone colder than I had ever heard. "You've been marked. You don't escape." I took a step back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. "What are you talking about?" "I just work here." "I don't know what you're—" She raised a hand, silencing me. Her fingers glowed faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. "You saw us. You saw what we do. And now, we're here to finish what we started." Before I could react, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the diner dropped, a cold wind filling the room. Then, with a suddenness that took my breath away, the tall man lunged toward me. His knife gleamed in the dim light, but just as quickly, someone, blocked him. The woman. She stepped in front of me, her hand raised. And with a single movement, the air around us shifted. The lights flickered wildly, and then, for a split second, everything went dead quiet. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the glass coffee pot behind the counter, there was someone, standing in the corner of the diner. But this figure wasn't human. It was a shape, a shadow, a void that seemed to suck in the light around it. The woman smiled. And I knew then that I was no longer alone. I couldn't breathe. My throat felt tight as if something heavy was pressing against my chest. I looked at the woman, this creature that stood before me with her pale face and glowing eyes. My mind screamed that I needed to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, but something held me frozen in place. The tall man, still gripping the knife, stepped back, his smile now a twisted grin. "You thought you could escape this, didn't you? You thought you were safe. But now, you're part of the story. There's no turning back." The woman's eyes narrowed, and without looking at him, she raised her hand. The air around us thickened, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air now, a mist of cold that clung to my skin. "What are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse and trembling. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the tall man, who, to my horror, took a step back as if submitting to her. The power between them was undeniable. This wasn't just a game. This wasn't just a robbery or some random act of violence. I was involved in something far darker than I could comprehend. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "You saw us. You shouldn't have. And now, the price is high." My blood ran cold. The woman's words echoed in my mind. "The price is high. What do you want from me?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. The tall man let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't a sound of humor. It was a warning. "We don't want much," he said slowly. "Just that you understand. We were always here. You just saw the wrong thing at the wrong time. The woman's face remained impassive, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. You've seen more than enough. And now, you're part of this. It wasn't just the words that chilled me, it was the way she said it. As if I was being written into something that had no end. As if I had no say in the matter. I took a step back, trying to reach for something, anything. The coffee pot. The broom. But it was no use. My hands shook uncontrollably. I could feel the heavy weight of their presence pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. And then, as if they had been waiting for something, the woman stepped forward. Her hand extended toward me, her fingers barely touching the air, and a crackling sound filled the diner. I could feel the energy shift around us, the walls of the diner seeming to grow heavier, the shadows lengthening in unnatural ways. I could see it now. In the corner of the diner, the figure, this shadowed thing that hadn't been there a moment ago, was growing. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was a distortion of everything, a void that consumed the light around it, stretching, twisting, as if it was becoming more than just a shape. I stumbled backward, but my feet wouldn't obey. My legs were leaden, my mind hazy. The shadows, they were moving closer. I could feel the weight of the thing, no, the presence, closing in on me. "Run," the woman whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. But there was no escape. Not now. The tall man stepped toward the door, his grin wide. "You're in this now. You've always been in this." The shadows were alive, crawling over the floor like tendrils of darkness, reaching for me. I could hear them, feel them, scraping at the very fabric of the diner. The woman didn't move, just watched as I struggled to move, to escape, but it was hopeless. And then the voice came again. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even human. It was a sound, a whisper, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows paused, as if listening to the voice, waiting for its command. "This one's too late." I turned, eyes wide, but there was no one else in the diner. I was alone. Or so I thought. Who said that?" I gasped, my breath shallow. The tall man, the woman, both of them seemed unaffected by the voice, as if they had heard it before. "You'll find out soon enough," the woman said, her voice barely audible over the deafening silence that followed. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in small clouds. The shadows were getting closer, crawling toward me, and the presence in the corner, that void, was pulsing now, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting. I didn't understand it, but I felt it. The overwhelming dread. The feeling that everything was about to collapse. And then, the woman raised her hand again. The air cracked with energy, and I felt it, something tearing through the fabric of reality. The diner seemed to bend, as if reality itself was warping. "We should have never let you live," the voice whispered again, this time directly in my ear. I screamed, but the sound didn't escape my lips. It was as if the air around me had thickened, absorbing my voice, leaving me silent. In the blink of an eye, the world around me shifted. The shadows erupted, rushing toward me, enveloping me like a blanket of darkness. I tried to move, to scream, but it was too late. I was suffocating in the void. And then, as I felt the last bit of light slip away, I heard one final thing, the woman's voice, as cold as ever. "You shouldn't have seen us." The darkness swallowed me whole. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was something else. Something heavier, thicker, colder. It clung to my skin, weighed down my thoughts, and wrapped around my mind. The last thing I remembered was hearing that voice, whispering, low and insistent, "You shouldn't have seen us." Then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The very essence of the world around me felt wrong, distorted. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. It was as if the diner, the room, and everything I had known had vanished into a hollow space, between places, between time. But just as I thought I might lose my mind entirely, I felt it. A shift in the air. A sudden pull, like gravity had stopped working the way it was supposed to. I gasped as the shadows around me seemed to shift, swirling around like liquid smoke. A voice, a familiar voice, whispered through the dense silence. "Jenna," I blinked, trying to focus, to make sense of anything. My pulse was racing, my body trembling, but there was no way out. "Who's there?" I tried to speak, but my words came out strangled, barely audible. And then, from the dark mist that surrounded me, I saw them again. The woman. The tall man. But they weren't just standing there. They were, floating. The tall man's eyes gleamed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. The woman, though silent, watched me with her cold, knowing stare, her fingers twitching slightly. And behind them, in the corners of this twisted, endless space, the shadows moved, alive, sentient, wrapping themselves around every surface like a hungry beast. "You really thought you could escape?" The tall man's voice was thick with mockery. "You should have known better." I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It was like walking through fog, through nothingness. My mind raced. "What is this place?" The woman's voice answered before I could even ask. "This is where you belong now," she said, her tone as cold as the chill in the air. "Where the shadows belong. Where we belong." I tried to understand, but the weight of it was too much. Shadows? Belong? The meaning didn't make sense. "You," I breathed, my voice hoarse. "You're not human." The tall man laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated around us. "Exactly. You shouldn't have seen us, Jenna. Not at the diner. Not when you were just trying to serve coffee." I trembled, backing into the oppressive, suffocating darkness. "But I don't understand," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I didn't do anything." The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "You saw what we do. What we've always done. You saw beyond the veil, past the illusions. That's why you're here. Why you can't leave." Something snapped inside me. No. I wouldn't let this be the end. My legs shook as I straightened, trying to stand tall in the midst of their oppressive presence. "What are you going to do with me?" The tall man tilted his head, his smile growing wider, colder. "That depends." He lifted a hand, and the shadows around us shifted. They seemed to crawl up his arm, coiling and twisting like a dark cloud made of smoke and malice. The very air pulsed with the power that surrounded them. "You're part of the story now, Jenna," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But you're not the only one who's seen too much. Everyone who comes close to us gets drawn in. Everyone who sees us," the woman interrupted, her voice smooth and sharp. "They get marked. And they're never the same again." I shook my head, trying to push through the terror that gripped me. I was suffocating, but I refused to give in to the panic. I couldn't. Suddenly, the shadows lashed out, and before I could react, they wrapped themselves around my arms, my legs, binding me in place. I gasped, struggling, but they felt like chains, cold, unyielding, suffocating. "You can't fight what's already inside you," the tall man said softly, his voice like a rasp against the quiet of the space. "You've seen us, Jenna. Now you'll never forget. You'll always be ours." My chest tightened as I felt something shift deep within me. I didn't know what they meant by ours, but whatever it was dark. It was wrong. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the terrifying thoughts swirling in my head. This isn't real. This can't be real. But as I opened them again, I saw the darkness surrounding me, its tendrils reaching toward me, pressing in. It wasn't a nightmare. This was happening. It was happening now. And then, the woman stepped forward, placing a cold hand on my forehead. Her touch sent a shock of icy electricity through my body, numbing me. "Now, you'll join us," she whispered, the words dripping with finality. The room, this place, seemed to collapse in on itself, the shadows now consuming everything. The tall man stepped back, and the shadows began to pulse, to swirl, until it was all I could see. In that moment, I realized the truth. They were the shadows. They had always been the shadows. And I had become one of them. The shadows tightened their grip around me, pulling me deeper into the void. The cold, oppressive weight was suffocating. I couldn't feel my limbs anymore, only the pressure, the pull of something dark and endless. My heart raced in my chest, beating so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. But there was something else. A voice, soft and insistent, echoing in the dark. "Jenna," it wasn't the tall man or the woman. It wasn't the voice that had haunted me throughout this nightmare. This voice, this one, I knew. "Jenna, you have to fight." It was him. The man with the gun, the one who had stepped in that night, the one who had saved me. He was the one who had brought me back, who had pushed them away long enough for me to survive. I could feel it now, his presence, like a faint light in the distance, calling me back from the edge of the abyss. I didn't know how, but I focused on that voice. The voice that promised hope when everything else seemed lost. I reached for it, my mind grasping desperately for anything that could pull me out of the darkness. And then, I felt it. A spark. The shadows around me seemed to recoil, as if they were suddenly unsure. I could feel their coldness, like a living thing, a creature of pure darkness, but there was something else. Something powerful rising within me, something that didn't belong in this place. The spark grew, becoming a fire, pushing back against the suffocating tendrils that had bound me. The woman's cold gaze locked with mine, her lips curling into a smile, but there was uncertainty there. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. You can't fight this," she whispered, her voice no longer so sure. But I was already moving. The shadows, once so tight around me, began to loosen. I focused on the light, the voice, and it grew stronger. My hands, once bound, broke free. The shadows recoiled, twisting and hissing as I willed them away. With a scream of defiance, I stood. My body shook, but my will was stronger. "I will not be yours." The tall man lunged at me, the knife in his hand gleaming with malicious intent, but I was faster. The light within me blazed brighter, and the shadows around us shattered. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor, but the woman, her face twisted with rage, stepped forward. "You can't escape this, Jenna," she hissed. "You're ours. You always will be." But I wasn't listening anymore. The woman's words became a distant murmur, fading into the background. I didn't need them. I didn't need their fear. "I'm not yours." The room, the void, seemed to tremble. And with a final push of will, I reached out with everything I had. The shadows that had haunted me, the oppressive darkness, the twisted power that had tried to claim me, all of it crumbled before the light. It splintered and fractured, breaking apart like glass, until there was nothing left but silence. I gasped for breath, my heart pounding as if it had never stopped. My hands shook as I looked around, blinking. The void was gone. The diner was back, real, and it was quiet. The air was warm. I was standing in the middle of the counter, alone. The tall man. The woman. The shadows. They were gone. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Was it over? Had I truly escaped? Or was I just trapped in another twisted illusion? But then, I heard the door jingle. I froze, heart in my throat, but it wasn't them. It was him. The man with the gun stepped into the diner, his eyes scanning the room before they found me. His face was tired, but there was something comforting about his presence. "You made it out," he said quietly, as if he had known all along. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. My legs gave way beneath me, and I sank into one of the booths, finally letting myself breathe. I felt drained. Empty. But in a way, it was a relief. A relief to know that it was over. Or at least, I hoped it was. "You're safe," he said. I swallowed, wiping the tears that had started to form in my eyes. "I thought I was done," I whispered. "I thought I was lost." He shook his head, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his face. "You're stronger than you know." And with that, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled behind him, and just like that, the diner was empty once more. But not in the same way. I had survived. I had made it out. And I knew now that the shadows, whatever they were, couldn't have me. Not again. As I stood there, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of coffee and grease, I felt something shift in me. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I wasn't a victim of some strange force. I was something more. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to smile.